I spent 3 decades sleeping beside a man who had been sleeping with other women, and I didn't find out until I was 59 years old, on a Tuesday, in the middle of folding his laundry, with the radio humming in the background and the scent of fabric softener thick in the air. That's when it happened. The moment the life I thought I had been living fell apart in one breathless, humiliating instant. And from that moment on, I made a decision. Not in rage, not in weakness, but in silence. I would burn down everything he built on my back, and I would do it slowly, precisely, and without mercy. It began with a text message. An accident, I thought at first. His phone had been left on the nightstand. I never looked through it, not in all our years, not because I was naive, but because I trusted him with the kind of blind faith that only comes from routine. But that morning, something strange caught my eye. A message from a name I didn't recognize. Last night was perfect. I needed that. Same time next week? At first, I didn't even understand what I was reading. I stared at the screen like it was a riddle, some cruel mistake. But the text wasn't old. It had been sent just hours ago, while I was asleep in the next room. I scrolled. I shouldn't have. But I did. What I found wasn't one message. It was hundreds. Different names, different numbers, all with the same sickening tone, all pointing to one truth I had never prepared myself to face. He had been cheating. Not once. Not recently. Not accidentally. It had been going on for years. Years. I confronted him that night. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I simply placed his phone on the kitchen table and waited for him to see what I had seen. His face didn't even register shock, only fear, the kind that comes from knowing the lie is finally over and there's no way to turn it back. I can explain, he started, as if 30 years of betrayal could be summarized in a sentence. You won't, I said quietly, because I'm done listening to liars. He tried to reach for me, physically, emotionally. I'm still not sure. But I stepped back. I wasn't ready to feel anything that would confuse the clarity that had arrived like a thunderclap in my chest. For days, I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't tell the kids. I didn't cry to friends. I went through the motions, coffee, errands, cooking, like a ghost of the woman I had once been. But beneath the surface, something else was forming. Not grief, not helplessness. Something harder, sharper. I wasn't going to leave him. No, I was going to ruin him. That might sound dramatic, childish even. But let me be very clear. I had given that man the best of me, the best years, the best effort. I had supported his dreams when mine were put on hold. I had smiled at dinners where I was invisible, ironed his shirts for meetings where I was never mentioned, held his hand through job losses and funerals and hospital scares. I had built a life around a lie, and I was done being noble about it. So I started with his accounts, not in the obvious ways. No, I was smarter than that. I had been in charge of our household finances for years. He let me take the reins because he never cared to learn, so I used that ignorance. I began siphoning small amounts from our joint savings into a new account he didn't know existed. Not thousands, hundreds. Just enough to go unnoticed. Just enough to build a wall between us that he couldn't see but would soon feel. Next, I began cataloguing everything. Every receipt, every withdrawal. I pulled credit reports. I accessed old insurance statements. I created a folder, one physical, one digital, filled with every secret he had kept from me, and everyone he hadn't bothered to hide well enough. I wasn't just going to divorce him. I was going to expose him, dismantle him, undo him from the inside out. I visited a lawyer 2 weeks later. A woman, recommended to me quietly by a friend who had gone through her own storm. Her office was modest, but sharp, like her. I brought a manila envelope with me, filled with the early evidence. She read through it slowly, nodding occasionally, her expression unreadable. When she finally looked up, she said something I will never forget. "You've already done half my job." "I want him to leave with nothing," I said. She nodded again, this time with a small smile. "Then we'll make sure he does." I walked out of that office not as a victim, not as a woman scorned, but as someone reborn in the cold, clean fire of betrayal. The pain had not disappeared, of course not, but it had become something I could carry, something that sharpened my focus rather than clouded it. He still didn't know. He thought I was processing. He thought we might work through it, that I would cry, beg, plead, that maybe, with time, I'd forgive. He was wrong. I had already begun writing the final chapter of his story, and this time, I would be the one holding the pen, and I wouldn't stop until he finally understood what it meant to lie beside a woman for 30 years and think she would never stand up. He still came home every night at 6:30, just as he had for the past 3 decades, walking through the door with the same practiced smile and empty questions. "How was your day?" he would ask, his tone light, habitual. And I would answer with equal precision. "Fine. Quiet. Nothing much." He believed we were in some strange, silent period of forgiveness, a pause before reconciliation, as if infidelity that spanned nearly half our lives could be mended with time, like a bruise instead of a break. But I wasn't healing. I was preparing. In the mornings, after he left for work, I sat at the dining room table with my laptop, not to check recipes or send emails, but to work through spreadsheets and legal documents. I had a plan, and plans take work. I mapped out every shared account, every asset, every piece of real estate and insurance. I made copies, hard and digital, of everything from tax returns to old anniversary cards he had sent me over the years, cards that now read like insults rather than sentiments. Some of them had been signed with phrases like, "Here's to forever," and "I'd be lost without you." I used to read those and feel cherished. Now I read them and saw a man who had perfected the art of compartmentalization, a man capable of holding hands with his wife at dinner while scheduling a hotel room for another woman the following weekend. He didn't just cheat. He constructed a life of deceit so meticulously that it took 30 years for me to find the first crack. But now that I had, I was pulling at it until the whole thing came down. My lawyer, Margaret, was brilliant, not dramatic, not cruel, efficient, focused. She told me that what we were doing required not just evidence, but patience. "Don't make noise," she warned. "Let him think you're quiet. Let him believe you're still deciding. That's when he'll start making mistakes." So I did exactly that. I was the model wife. I cooked dinner. I watched movies. I nodded in conversations. I asked him about work. I even slept beside him. Not because I wanted to, but because I wanted him to believe nothing had changed. I wanted him comfortable. Because when people are comfortable, they stop covering their tracks. And he did. A month after I discovered his secret life, he left his email open on our shared computer. He always had, assuming I had no reason to look. I did now. I scrolled. Dozens of messages, some months old, some recent, all with various names. Women I had never met. Women who probably had no idea he was married. Or worse, who knew and didn't care. They wrote about dinners and gifts and weekends away. One of them, Sarah, had been in his life for nearly 5 years. She wrote to him like a partner, not a fling. She signed her emails, "Forever yours." He had given my forever to someone else. I printed every message. I saved them to a flash drive. I made copies and stored them in 3 separate places. The more I uncovered, the colder I became. Not angry, cold, detached, focused. It turns out that when a person spends 30 years lying to you, the hurt doesn't arrive all at once. It trickles in, then pools, and then freezes. And I had frozen. One night, 2 months into my preparation, he mentioned taking a trip together. To reconnect, he said. To get away from all this heaviness. I smiled. I told him that sounded lovely. He thought it was a good sign. He didn't know I'd already filed the divorce petition. He didn't know that Margaret had arranged for the papers to be served while he was at work the following week. He didn't know that the house, my grandmother's house, the one we'd lived in for 27 years, was about to be legally transferred to my name only, thanks to a clause in the deed he'd never bothered to read. Because while he'd spent 30 years lying, I'd spent 30 years learning. Learning how to be quiet, how to hold a home together, how to read people's faces at dinner parties and fill in the gaps of conversation when he was too distracted or disinterested to try. I'd learned how to budget, how to manage his moods, how to survive long stretches of loneliness disguised as marriage. And now, I was putting all of that to use. On the morning he was served, I was in the kitchen making coffee. He came in, fresh from the shower, adjusting his tie, humming. The knock came just as he reached for his mug. I didn't move. I let him answer. I watched from the doorway as he opened the front door, and a man in a dark blazer handed him the envelope. "Mr. Harding?" the man asked. "You've been served." My husband stood there, motionless, staring at the papers as if they had been written in a language he couldn't understand. When he turned to me, his mouth opened, but no words came. I took a sip of coffee. Calm, quiet. "It's all there," I said. "Every detail, every account, every lie." He stepped forward, his face twisting into something between confusion and anger. "You can't just—" "I can," I interrupted, my voice soft but firm. "And I have." He tried to argue. He tried to plead. He asked for time, for explanation. But I had already heard every excuse before the first word left his mouth. Nothing he could say would make 30 years of betrayal vanish. "You broke it," I said finally. "Not just once. Not by accident. You broke it every single day for 3 decades. You don't get to act surprised now that it's over." He slept on the couch that night, and every night after that, until the court ordered him to leave. The neighbours gossiped, of course. Friends called, half in shock, half pretending they had never noticed anything strange. I didn't explain. I didn't defend. I simply lived. A little more freely each day, a little more loudly, or a little more honestly. And as the divorce moved through the courts, slowly but inarguably, I felt no sadness. Because I hadn't lost a husband. I had shed a lie. I never imagined that freedom could feel so quiet. There were no fireworks, no celebration, no great crescendo when he finally left the house with the last of his shirts folded into a suitcase I had bought for our 25th anniversary. It was just a Tuesday afternoon. The light outside was soft. The garden was blooming. And the door closed behind him with the gentlest click, like the world was agreeing with me. Yes, it was over now. He stood on the porch for a few moments, holding that suitcase, looking around like he might say something profound. But there was nothing left for him to say. I watched through the lace curtain, not hiding, just keeping distance. I had said everything weeks ago, in the documentation, in the bank transfers, in the silence that followed each of his pitiful attempts at negotiation. The house, for the first time in decades, belonged to me alone. Not just legally, though Margaret had ensured that detail was ironclad, but emotionally, spiritually. It no longer felt like a stage where I performed the role of a dutiful wife while the man beside me performed loyalty. It was mine now. Every creak of the floorboards, every photograph on the wall, every flower in the yard, all untouched by his betrayal. In the first week after his departure, I did something small but symbolic. I replaced the dining table. The old one had been a wedding gift from his parents. A long oak piece, heavy, imposing, meant to last a lifetime. How ironic that was now. I sold it to a young couple starting their own life, and I bought a simple round table with 4 soft green chairs. I placed it near the window, where the morning sun poured in, and I sat there alone with my coffee every morning, not lonely, but whole. Of course, he didn't stay quiet. The texts started soon after the court order. At first, they were bland, almost pitiful. Can we talk? I miss you. This doesn't have to end like this. I ignored them. Then they became sharper, accusatory. You blindsided me. You've changed. Don't forget everything I gave you. I didn't reply, because I hadn't forgotten. That was the problem. I remembered every forgotten birthday, every late-night phone call that he insisted was just work. Every time I made excuses for his absences to our children, our friends, even to myself. I remembered the way he would turn the volume up when I tried to speak, the way he'd roll his eyes when I brought up my own career, my own needs, the way he'd touch my shoulder in public like a possession, and then leave me untouched in private for weeks. He had given me so much, but most of it I never asked for. Margaret warned me early in the process that he might try to charm his way into a softer settlement. They always do when they realize the gravity of what they've lost, she said. And she was right. He sent a letter through his lawyer, a plea to reconsider the asset division, to remember the history we shared. I responded with 3 pages of itemized deceit. Years, names, hotel invoices, photos. He didn't ask again. And yet, there was still the matter of reputation, of perception. Divorce at our age, in a town like ours, was never just private. The whispers were polite, but ever present. People I'd known for years looked at me with thin sympathy or awkward curiosity. Some, I could tell, were waiting for me to fall apart. But I didn't. I walked into church on Sunday with my head high and my new haircut. I joined a local book club. I planted new bulbs in the front garden and waved at every neighbour who passed by, daring them to ask what had happened. A few did. I told them the truth. Not with bitterness, but with precision. He was unfaithful, I said once, over coffee with a friend who couldn't stop glancing at my left hand. For 30 years. Her eyes widened. You didn't know? I do now. I started volunteering at a nearby shelter, something I'd always wanted to do but had been too busy to commit to when my days were wrapped in his schedule, his needs. The work was hard, humbling, honest. I met women who had left far worse situations than mine, and women who hadn't yet found the strength to leave at all. One of them, younger than me by at least 20 years, asked how I'd done it, how I'd kept going. I stopped asking myself why he did it, I told her, and started asking why I stayed. That question had haunted me at first, but now it felt like freedom, because the answer didn't shame me, it illuminated me. I had stayed because I believed in what we had, because I valued loyalty, because I thought love meant endurance. But now I knew. Love does not mean sacrificing yourself on the altar of someone else's comfort. And loyalty? Loyalty must be mutual, or it's servitude. By the end of the summer, the divorce was finalized. I received the house, the savings account, and a small but meaningful pension. But what I valued most wasn't written into any legal document. It was the fact that I had emerged not broken, but sharpened, calmer, stronger. I had been faithful for 30 years. He had been faithless for just as long. And yet I was the one who rebuilt, who rose, who stayed steady. Not because I was special, but because I finally understood the difference between silence and strength. And I would never confuse them again. The most unexpected part of life after betrayal isn't the anger that arrives early, sharp, and certain, demanding your attention. It isn't the sadness either, though that will settle into your bones in quieter hours, particularly in the stillness of late evening when the house exhales and your thoughts have nowhere to hide. No, the most surprising part is the clarity. It comes slowly, like a light shifting across a wall you didn't know was there. You begin to see everything differently, not just him or what he did, but yourself, your routines, your compromises, the thousand ways you bent without even realizing you were folding. I began noticing just how much space I had made for him over the years. Physical, emotional, even linguistic. In conversations, I had always deferred. Let him speak first. Let him interrupt. Let him redefine what counted as serious or important. His job was always more urgent, his schedule more rigid, his exhaustion more valid. And like so many women of my generation, I had internalized the idea that being accommodating was being loving, that shrinking myself slightly, or sometimes entirely, was noble. I stopped doing that, not dramatically, not out of spite. I simply began speaking fully when someone asked me a question. I allowed myself to finish thoughts. I let silence hang when someone interrupted. And when I disagreed with something, whether in a community meeting, a casual conversation, or a passing remark from a well-meaning friend, I said so, calmly, directly, without apology. The first time I did it, I felt almost breathless afterward, like I had run uphill. But over time, that feeling faded, replaced by something steadier. Authority. Not the kind you're given, the kind you claim. One morning, while sorting through the last of the documents from the divorce, I came across a stack of old photographs buried in the back of the filing cabinet. Pictures from our early years, vacations, birthday dinners, the kids when they were small. I sat on the floor with them spread around me, like artifacts from a version of myself I barely recognized. In so many of them, I was smiling, wide, present. And yet, looking now with clearer eyes, I saw how little of myself was visible behind that smile. Always the photographer, the cook, the planner, the listener, rarely the subject. There was one photo in particular, taken at a dinner party maybe 15 years ago, where I stood in the background, slightly blurred, half turned toward the kitchen while everyone else laughed in the foreground. It struck me that I had lived my entire marriage in that position, slightly out of focus, always turned halfway towards something that needed to be done, someone else's comfort that needed maintaining. I held that photo for a long time. I didn't cry. I just looked at her, at me, and thought, she deserved more. The children, by then, knew everything, not in graphic detail, but enough to understand the scope. I told them the truth without theatrics. Their father had not been faithful, and the marriage had ended because I was no longer willing to live inside someone else's fiction. They were grown, living their own lives, but I could see the shift in how they looked at me. It was no longer through the narrow lens of Mom, the ever dependable. It was with a kind of new recognition, the understanding that I was a woman who had made a decision most people spend their whole lives avoiding. One afternoon, my daughter asked if I had ever suspected. I was standing at the sink, rinsing strawberries, sunlight pouring in through the window, and I paused for a long moment before answering. Maybe, I said finally, but I didn't let myself look closely enough, because looking would have meant admitting what I already knew. She didn't speak for a while. Then she said quietly, "I'm proud of you." And I realized in that moment, more than anything, that reclaiming my life hadn't only been for me, it had been for them too. To show them that love without respect is not a sacrifice, it's a slow disappearance, and that it's never too late to choose yourself, even if that choice comes decades later than you wish it had. I started making small changes around the house. Nothing dramatic. I replaced the bedding in the guest room, the one he always called his nap room, with soft linens in colours I loved. I painted the front door a deep teal and had the locks changed. I ordered new dishes, not because I needed them, but because I wanted to eat every meal on something that hadn't once held his silence. I donated every necktie he left behind, every pair of shoes. I kept none of his letters. I wasn't erasing history. I was reclaiming narrative. There were still hard days, of course. Loneliness has a strange way of creeping in even when you're surrounded by peace. But I learned how to sit with it, how to let it speak, without letting it decide. I went to the farmers' market on Saturday mornings and smiled at people I didn't know. I joined a writing group at the library and brought cookies to share. I let myself laugh, really laugh, when something was funny. And I stopped explaining myself to anyone who asked what had happened between me and that lovely man. I told the truth. He lied. I left. I'm better now. Not happy every day. Not whole yet. But real. Finally. Entirely. Real. And as the year turned quietly toward fall, I found myself standing on the porch one evening, wrapped in a shawl, holding a mug of tea, watching the sky shift from gold to deep violet. It was the same sky I had watched for years, but now it belonged to me. And for the first time in 30 years, I did not wonder when he would come home, because I was already home. I had built it, rebuilt it, around myself. No longer waiting, no longer watching, just here. Still, steady, and more alive than I had been in decades. By the time autumn settled in with its golden hush and wind that smelled faintly of wood smoke, I had not only grown used to the silence in the house, I had come to cherish it. It no longer felt like a reminder of absence. It felt like permission. Permission to breathe without bracing for impact, to sit without being interrupted, to make decisions without consulting someone whose respect for me had quietly withered long before I noticed. I had learned to live with myself again, and in that learning, I discovered just how much of myself I had once given away without realizing it. People kept asking if I was dating yet, as though loneliness had to be filled immediately, as though a woman in her 60s without a man beside her was unfinished. I would smile politely and say, "No, I'm not interested," which was true, but not in the way they assumed. It wasn't that I had closed my heart. It was that I had finally opened it to myself, and I wasn't eager to hand it over again, especially not to someone who might expect to be rewarded just for staying faithful, as if that was a rare virtue instead of the minimum. I had spent 30 years with a man who treated loyalty as optional, and I had stayed, thinking that endurance equaled love. But endurance without joy is survival, not partnership. And now that I was living alone, fully, consciously, I realized how little he had contributed to the emotional weight of our home. He had been a presence, but never a foundation. In October, I traveled alone for the first time. Just a few days. A rental car, a small cabin near a lake, a stack of books, a basket of tea. I didn't tell many people. I didn't ask for advice or approval. I simply packed and went. The air was sharp and clean, the sky wide and indifferent. I sat on the porch each morning wrapped in a blanket, watching the mist rise off the water, and I felt something in my chest unclench, not just from his betrayal, but from my own years of self-erasure. I journaled every day, long entries, not poetic or polished, raw and honest. I wrote about the first year of our marriage, when I still thought love was about fixing things. I wrote about the subtle ways he had chipped at my confidence, small jokes that lingered, comparisons he thought I didn't notice. I wrote about the children and how they had seen too much and said too little. And I wrote about myself, not who I had been, but who I was now becoming. A woman who no longer feared being misunderstood, a woman who no longer begged to be prioritized. When I returned home, the leaves had shifted into full fire. The maple tree out front blazed in reds and oranges, its branches scattering little bursts of freedom across the lawn. I raked them slowly, deliberately. I didn't rush through the task the way I used to when he would complain that the yard looked unkempt. I took my time, letting the wind rearrange my work as I moved through it, letting nature be imperfect the way I had finally allowed myself to be. One afternoon, as I finished bagging the last of the leaves, a letter arrived in the mail. Unfamiliar handwriting, no return address. I opened it cautiously, curious more than nervous. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No greeting, no signature. Just one sentence, written in that unmistakable slant of his. I didn't know what I had until it was gone. I read it twice. Then I tore it in half, dropped it into the recycling bin, and went inside. Because closure doesn't come from them. It comes from the decision not to need anything more. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt settled, grounded, like someone who had finally stepped fully into her own name. In the evenings, I began cooking for pleasure again. Not for him, not to fill a table or meet a schedule, but for myself. Roasted vegetables, hearty soups, baked apples with cinnamon. I ate slowly, savoring each bite without distraction, without conversation. Just the sounds of the house around me, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floor, the soft tick of the clock. It had taken me 30 years to realize I had never truly been alone. And yet, I had always been lonely. Now I was alone. And I was not lonely. Not anymore. By November, I had stopped thinking of my old life as something I had lost. It had become something I had shed, like an old skin, worn too long, constricting and brittle. What remained underneath wasn't raw or uncertain the way I had feared. It was sturdy. It was mine. The routines I rebuilt were simple but satisfying, grounded not in service to someone else's expectations, but in the quiet, deliberate act of honoring my own. I began waking up earlier, before the sun, and lighting a single candle in the kitchen while the kettle boiled. There was something reverent in that act, a small flame flickering against the dark, a reminder that I didn't need grand things to feel sacred. I would sit by the window, wrapped in an old shawl, listening to the quiet, watching the first outlines of the trees emerge from the darkness. Those mornings were mine alone. No questions, no demands, no need to perform peace for someone who had never deserved it. I started writing more, not just journaling, but real writing, stories, fragments, memories that had long been buried under the noise of years. I joined a local memoir group that met every other Thursday in the basement of the library. Most of us were older, women mostly, and all of us were learning what it meant to reclaim narrative. There was something powerful about sitting in a circle of voices that had once been silenced and watching each one find shape and sound again. When it was my turn to read, I chose a piece I'd written about a trip we'd taken early in our marriage. A weekend at the coast when the car had broken down and we spent the night in a motel that smelled like bleach and damp carpet. In the story, I described how I had laughed then, even as I sat on a stained bedspread in my nicest dress, trying to make the best of a ruined evening. The group chuckled when I read that line. Afterward, one woman leaned over and said softly, "It's strange, isn't it? How we were always the ones smoothing things over, even when we were the ones bleeding." I nodded, because yes, it was strange, and it was over. The holidays crept in, soft and inevitable. For the first time in years, I didn't host Thanksgiving. I didn't roast the turkey or set the long table or send out the detailed invitations. Instead, I let my daughter host. I brought 2 pies and a bottle of wine. I wore a burgundy sweater and silver earrings that I had bought for myself. And when I walked into her home and felt the warmth of laughter and children and food, I felt no sting of absence, only gratitude. He was not there. And neither was the part of me that had once curled inward whenever he entered a room. After dinner, while the others napped or played games, I sat by the window with my granddaughter, 6 years old, all questions and curls. She looked up at me suddenly and asked, "Grandma, why do you live alone now?" I didn't flinch. I didn't sugarcoat. "Because it's better than living with someone who didn't treat me kindly," I said gently. "And now I get to do what makes me happy." She thought for a moment, then nodded. "That makes sense," she said. And then she asked if we could go outside and look at the stars. Later that night, when I returned home and walked into the quiet of my house, I stood for a long time in the hallway. The lights were low. The air smelled of cinnamon and the pine cone candle I'd lit before leaving, and I felt the peace of returning to a space that no longer carried his shadow. I touched the wall lightly as I passed, not out of sentiment, but out of recognition. This was home now, not because he had once lived here, but because he no longer did. I had spent too many years as a footnote in my own story, and now, finally, I was writing the chapters myself. And I wasn't rushing. I wasn't apologizing. I was simply continuing, one steady, clear word at a time. The first snow arrived in mid-December, soft and slow, blanketing the neighborhood in a hush that even the wind respected. I stood at the kitchen window that morning, hands wrapped around a steaming mug, watching the flakes settle onto the branches, the porch railings, the path I had swept clean only the day before. There was something ceremonial about that first snowfall, not just the quiet it brought, but the way it made everything look freshly drawn, as though the world had agreed to start again. I hadn't decorated much for the holidays. A small wreath on the door, a string of warm white lights in the front window, and a modest pine tree I'd carried in myself and placed by the fireplace. No ornaments from the past, no shared mementos, just simple, quiet light. For years, the holidays had been a performance, elaborate meals, smiling photos, choreographed cheer. He had always insisted on hosting, though he'd disappear halfway through dinner to take a call or refill his drink or sit in silence while I made small talk and kept the peace. Now the season belonged to me in the way it never had before, not as an obligation, but as a choice. I baked, yes, but not because I had to. I baked because I liked the smell of cinnamon and cloves, because I enjoyed kneading dough in the morning sun, because it reminded me that my hands still knew how to create warmth. I played music when I felt like it. I sent cards only to people I truly cared for. I lit candles in the evening and let the flames flicker in rooms no longer dimmed by tension. That December, I also did something I hadn't done since I was a young woman. I made a list of resolutions. Not goals, not promises to become something else. Just quiet intentions. A commitment to continue showing up for myself. To write more. To take walks even when it rained. To say no without explanation. To let myself rest without guilt. I kept the list in a small notebook by my bed, next to a pen and a small reading lamp. It wasn't for anyone else's eyes. It wasn't part of some New Year cliché. It was a reminder that I was still here, still evolving, still choosing. On Christmas morning, I woke early, not to prepare a feast or unwrap presents with practiced delight, but to simply enjoy the stillness. I made a pot of tea and sat in my robe, wrapped in a blanket by the window, watching the world outside slowly light up with pale gold. Snow still covered the yard, untouched. There were no footsteps in the driveway, no voices downstairs, no television humming with parade coverage. It was just me. And for the first time in my adult life, that didn't feel like absence. It felt like peace. The children came by in the afternoon, just for a short visit, as planned. They brought leftovers, little gifts, stories from their own mornings. We sat around the kitchen table, the round one I had chosen, and laughed. Not forced laughter, not the kind that hides tension beneath volume, but real, unrushed, mutual laughter. I watched my son carefully pack up the dishes afterward, my daughter leaning against the counter, sipping tea, and I thought, this is what family looks like when it is honest, when it is small, but safe. He had sent a card. I knew he would. It arrived a few days before Christmas, addressed to me in that slanted handwriting that had once felt so familiar. Inside was a photograph of a beach. No message, no signature. Just an image of a place we had once visited, now stripped of context. I didn't keep it. I placed it in the paper bin without a second glance, and I felt no remorse. Not because I was angry, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I had stopped needing symbols from someone who had forfeited the right to be part of my story. Whatever life he was living now, wherever he was no longer mine to carry, and I would no longer leave space for him in places I had fought so hard to reclaim. That evening, I walked through the house slowly, turning off the lights room by room. I passed the fireplace, the small tree, the neat pile of dishes drying in the sink. I stood for a moment in the hallway, my fingers resting lightly on the banister, and listened. There was no silence like the silence of a house you've made entirely your own. No unspoken tension behind the walls, no second guessing, no fear of the door opening with news you never wanted to hear. Just breathe. Stillness. Ownership, not of property, but of self. And as I climbed the stairs to bed, I didn't look back. There was no longer anything behind me I needed to hold on to. January arrived, not with fireworks or fanfare, but with a quiet breath of frost across the windows and the comforting stillness that came from knowing that I had absolutely nothing left to pretend. The days were short, the air sharp, and yet I found myself savouring even the coldest walks, bundled tightly in my coat, with my scarf wrapped snug beneath my chin, because the wind on my face reminded me, insistently, unavoidably, that I was still here. I didn't need anyone else's gaze to confirm it, didn't require a witness or a mirror or a shared morning routine to feel real. I felt myself in my feet against the floor, in the warmth of my fingertips against a teacup, in the pages of the books I now read each night, without interruption, without compromise. I was no longer living for someone else's timeline, no longer bending around another person's need to be adored while offering nothing in return. There was something strangely beautiful about the rhythm of a winter spent alone, not in isolation, but in peace. I rearranged the furniture in the living room one weekend, just because I could, because I'd always wanted the light to fall differently across the rug in the early hours of the afternoon. I bought new curtains, soft, thick ones the colour of late dusk, and replaced the old ones he had chosen, the ones he insisted looked clean, though they never suited the room. I took a long, meandering drive through the countryside one Sunday, stopping at a roadside shop where I bought a hand-thrown mug glazed in deep blue and olive green. The woman at the counter smiled and asked if I was headed somewhere special. "No," I said. "I'm just out enjoying the road." And I meant it. That road had no destination beyond the fact that I was driving it for myself, not to get somewhere, but simply to go. It took me years to understand how many small freedoms I had handed over in my marriage. And not just because he cheated, not just because he lied. Those betrayals were colossal, yes, but they were built on the smaller ones I had dismissed for decades. The way he'd dismiss my preferences as fussy, the way he would speak for me in front of others, the way he'd mock something I'd read or cooked or worn, as if his opinion was the only one that mattered. He didn't just betray our vows. He had chipped away at my voice until all that remained was a woman who smiled too often and stayed too quiet. That woman no longer lived here. At the community centre, I gave a reading from one of my essays. I hadn't planned to. I usually sat and listened, occasionally offering comments or encouragement. But this time, something in me leaned forward when they asked for volunteers. I stood up, palms only slightly trembling, and read a piece I'd written about the moment I realized my silence wasn't grace. It was fear. When I finished, no one applauded right away. There was just a long, full quiet, and then someone exhaled, deeply, as though they'd been holding their breath. One woman near the back wiped a tear and mouthed, "Thank you." I sat down, not because I needed validation, but because I'd said something true, and that was enough. One evening, while I was sorting through an old box in the attic, I found a letter I had written to him years ago, but never sent. It was from a time when I had felt him pulling away, not visibly, not enough to name, but enough to bruise. The letter was filled with questions. Do you still love me? Do you see me? What are we anymore? I had never mailed it. I had folded it back up, tucked it away, and kept going. I read it now and didn't feel sorrow or regret, only astonishment at how long I had waited for someone to love me loudly while I continued to love him quietly, hoping it would be enough. I burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the paper curl and blacken into silence. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt clean. I was, by then, handling everything on my own. Taxes, home maintenance, scheduling, repairs. When the pipes froze for the first time, I didn't panic. I called the plumber, asked intelligent questions, and took notes. When the garage door jammed in the middle of a snowstorm, I bundled up and fixed it with my own hands, gloves stiff with cold, cheeks raw, breath rising like smoke in the night air. I felt strong, not invincible, not superhuman, just capable. And that was more than I had felt in years. Sometimes, in quieter moments, I'd remember a version of myself, younger, less sure, sitting on the edge of our bed, waiting for him to come home late from work, rehearsing casual things to say that wouldn't sound like suspicion. I remembered how I'd line up the details in my head, trying to convince myself that the truth wasn't what I feared it was. But now, I no longer wasted time arguing with my intuition. It had saved me, and I had finally learned to trust it. That winter, I began planning a trip for spring. Not far, just a train ride away, to a town I'd always wanted to visit but had never gotten around to. He had always said it was too quaint, too boring, not worth the time. That alone was reason enough to go. I booked a small bed and breakfast with lace curtains and floral quilts and a garden bench I could already imagine sitting on with my journal. I marked the dates in ink on the calendar, not tentative, not penciled in, but fixed. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't triumph. It was something far quieter, the gentle, certain reclaiming of the life I was no longer afraid to live. And I knew, as the snow thickened outside and the fire warmed the room behind me, that this time the story belonged to me entirely. When March finally arrived, dragging the last of winter's chill behind it and allowing the first early crocuses to push their heads through the thawing earth, I began to feel, in my bones, not just my thoughts, that I had passed through something permanent. The grief was no longer clawing. The betrayal no longer hissed behind every idle moment. The weight hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. It had become part of me. Not something I carried atop my shoulders, but something internal, integrated. A scar, not a wound. A story, not a question. I had stopped asking why, had stopped needing his lies to line up, stopped rereading old conversations and looking for cracks that now seemed so obvious I could barely understand how I had ever missed them. And yet I had. For 30 years, I had not only missed them, I had patched over them, lovingly, methodically, like someone restoring a wall they didn't know was already collapsing from the inside. Now, the restoration I was undertaking was entirely my own. The trip I had planned for spring, just a few hours by train to a small historic town nestled between two rivers and surrounded by hills that looked like folded velvet when the sun began to set, became something more than a getaway. It became a promise. Not a break from life, but a continuation of it, on my own terms. I packed lightly but with intention. A comfortable coat, 2 scarves, my worn, leather-bound journal, the novel I'd been putting off reading for years, and a tin of tea I'd grown fond of during long, quiet evenings at home. I didn't ask anyone to check on me, didn't leave a note on the fridge, or a trail of details to be remembered. For once, I wasn't accountable to anyone's expectations, but my own. The train ride itself was a kind of meditation. I sat by the window and watched the world slide by, farms and fences and flashes of water, the skeletons of trees just beginning to wake. There was a peace in the movement, no urgency, no destination I had to justify, no one waiting for me at the other end. Just the soft rhythm of forward motion, the steady hum of being carried somewhere for no reason other than that I had chosen to go. The bed and breakfast was small and lovely in that distinctly intentional way. Hand-sewn curtains, mismatched china, lavender soap in the bathroom that filled the room with scent before I even turned on the light. The woman who ran the place, Anne, was older than me by at least a decade, and within 10 minutes of checking in, we had settled into the easy, almost unspoken rapport that can only form between two women who have both lived through the unravelling of their lives and come out the other side quieter, but unshaken. She didn't ask why I was alone, and I didn't explain. Instead, we talked about birds and gardens and the best cafe down the street for soup and homemade bread. I went there the next morning and sat in the corner near the window with my notebook open and no plan. I didn't write about him. I didn't write about what he did or how long he'd been doing it. I didn't need to. That story had already been told. already folded into the shape of who I was now. Instead, I wrote about the river I'd seen from the train, the way it split around an island and rejoined itself as if nothing had happened. I wrote about the crooked steps of the old bookstore I wandered into that afternoon, and how the floorboards creaked in a way that felt like memory, not decay. For the first time in what felt like decades, I didn't think about whether I was being seen. I didn't feel observed. I didn't feel like someone performing solitude for effect or strength as a defense. I simply was, entirely, fully, quietly myself. And it was enough. On the second evening, after a dinner of roasted vegetables and lentils, I sat on the porch with a mug of warm cider, watching the sky darken into a rich, endless navy. The stars blinked slowly into view, not in clusters, but one by one, like a secret being told patiently. I let the air settle around me, wrapped the blanket tighter around my shoulders, and listened to nothing but the wind and the sound of the garden gate swaying in the breeze. That night, I dreamed not of the past, not of him, or our house, or the versions of myself I had left behind, but of the river again, flowing steadily, cleanly, making its way around obstacles without complaint, without drama, without needing anyone's permission to move forward. When I returned home the next day, everything was exactly where I had left it. The key turned in the lock with a quiet click. The air inside the house was still, settled, familiar not with history, but with presence. I set down my bag, took off my coat, and stood in the center of the room for a long moment, not because I felt displaced, but because I wanted to acknowledge that I had changed. I had left with the intention of traveling alone, but what I hadn't realized until I returned was that I was no longer accompanied by ghosts. They hadn't followed me. I hadn't brought them. They were not welcome in this version of my life. That night, I took down the last framed photo of him, one I had ignored for months, tucked high on a shelf, left there more out of forgetfulness than attachment. I placed it gently in a drawer, not out of bitterness, but because the man in that picture no longer had any bearing on the woman who now stood in this room. I didn't need to destroy him. I didn't need to erase every memory, but I no longer needed him in my line of sight. I made myself a bowl of soup, lit a candle, and read until I fell asleep on the couch with the book still open on my chest. When I woke, sometime after midnight, I looked around and smiled. This, I thought, is what it means to come home to yourself. And I would never again trade that for the illusion of being loved by someone who never truly saw me. By the time spring fully arrived, not with a single dramatic change, but with the gradual unfolding of green along the trees and the slow emergence of blossoms where only bare branches had been weeks before, I realized I had passed through something far larger than divorce, larger even than betrayal. What I had undergone was a rebirth, one that came not with joy or celebration, but with clarity and the quiet, unwavering resolve of someone who had made peace with the past without asking it to apologize. Life no longer felt like something I was recovering from. It felt like something I was shaping with my own hands, day by steady day. I began gardening again, not the way I used to when I was younger, racing to create something impressive, something curated for others to admire. But slowly, carefully, with a kind of reverence. I planted what I wanted, where I wanted, without worrying whether it would be worth the work or if it would match the house. Some plants flourished, some didn't. I didn't take it personally. I just adjusted and tried again. That lesson alone felt like a kind of prayer, to move forward, to grow without fear of failure. My children came by more often, not out of guilt, not out of obligation, but out of what felt like genuine presence. They had watched me unravel and reassemble myself piece by piece, and I think, in their own quiet way, they admired it. My daughter, especially, began to speak to me differently, less as a mother who had always been a fixture in the background of her life, and more as a woman who had made a choice most people don't. We would sit together on the porch with coffee or wine and talk about things that once felt off limits: disappointment, resentment, the weight of marriage, the danger of silence. There were moments when I caught a flicker of grief in her eyes, not for the man her father had turned out to be, but for the years I had spent hiding my own unhappiness in order to keep everything functioning. "I don't think I ever saw you this way before," she said one afternoon, her voice soft, hesitant. "Not really. I thought you were just settled, comfortable." "I thought that too," I replied, "for a long time, until I realized I was just numb." She didn't respond, but she nodded slowly, and I knew something inside her had shifted too. Perhaps she would make different choices. Perhaps not. But at least now she saw me, not the mother, not the wife, not the background, but the full, living person. I went back to teaching, just part-time, just once a week at the local library, writing for seniors. Not because I needed the money, but because I missed the structure, the sharing of stories, the sound of pencils scratching paper as people reached for parts of themselves they had forgotten how to speak aloud. One man, widowed, quiet, probably in his 70s, read a piece one evening about the moment he realized his wife had always been the stronger one. "I didn't know until she was gone," he said, and his voice cracked at the end. The room was quiet for a long time after that, and I felt an ache somewhere deep in my chest, not for my husband, not for our marriage, but for all the moments he had missed, all the things he had failed to see. One morning in April, I received a letter from him, not a card, not a vague, symbolic gesture. A real letter, 4 pages, handwritten, with neat lines and carefully chosen words. He wrote about regret, about shame, about the years he'd spent convincing himself that his needs were more urgent than anyone else's pain. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for anything. He simply wrote, "I know what I lost, and I know you didn't lose me. You freed yourself." I read it once. I folded it, and I placed it in a drawer I rarely opened, not out of anger, not out of dismissal, but because I didn't need it to live forward. Forgiveness, I had come to understand, wasn't always about the other person. Sometimes it was about choosing to stop carrying something that was never yours to hold in the first place. I forgave him, not so he would feel lighter, but so I would. I began to feel happiness again, not loud, not performative, not the kind I had once tried to project in Christmas cards and dinner parties, but real, settled joy, the kind that sneaks up on you when you're kneeling in the dirt planting tomatoes, or when you're halfway through a chapter and realize you've forgotten the world around you, or when you're laughing so hard with a friend that your chest aches and you forget what time it is. The house felt different now too, not emptier, fuller. Every corner had been touched by intention. I hung new art. I repainted the bathroom in a soft grey blue. I bought new towels, soft ones, ones I didn't have to share with anyone. I played music while I cooked, loud if I wanted. I danced once, barefoot in the kitchen, laughing at myself, and not caring that no one was there to watch. And one evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun fold itself gently beneath the hills, I realized that I had finally arrived. Not at a destination, but at myself. I had been loyal. I had been patient. I had been everything a woman is told to be. And when none of that was returned, when every vow was broken behind my back, not once, but over and over across decades, I didn't collapse. I didn't retaliate with cruelty. I didn't allow it to harden me. I simply stood up. I gathered the truth. I left the wreckage behind. And I built something better in its place. A life that was mine. A home filled with calm. A voice that no longer needed permission to be heard. He lost a wife, but I found myself. And in the quiet of that final spring, that was more than enough.